So today we're going to change the upper and lower seals on a Go Devil long shaft mud motor. To start doing that, you need to take a wrench or a big screwdriver and place it into the U-joint so that it will stop the shaft from turning. And then it takes a 1.25 inch open end wrench for this back nut, and you just spin that off there. Should come off fairly easily. There are 2 nuts, one right here, one behind it right here, that will come loose when you loosen the front one. When we were initially taking off the propeller, and I said put a wrench into the U-joint to stop it spinning, you want to do it on this back side and not the front one, because there is a grease zerk in there. And I'm not sure if you can see in there, but someone broke that off because they tried to put the screwdriver or wrench there instead of in the back. So I'm gonna have to try and deal with that as well. And this has been removed. There's one that is a lock nut with the nylon washer, one that's a regular nut, a lock washer, and one thin washer that goes against the propeller. That also comes off. Remove the propeller, the big pipe wrench. Find a way to get it held on to the propeller, keeping that wrench in the U-joint at the front. And once it grips, you're gonna have to pull pretty hard, and it should come loose. I did loosen it already, so that did come off pretty easily. And this propeller just unscrews off of the shaft. You'll also want to remove this nut. It's just an adjustable open end wrench. Remove that. These are right-handed threads, so righty-loosey. And I used a pipe wrench, kind of chewed it up, but it was pretty stuck on there. And just go right instead of left to loosen. All right, to remove this lower unit, it's screwed on to the actual shaft. You loosen this set screw with an Allen key, and it just unscrews. I had to use a pipe wrench to get a good enough grip on it to pull it off. To remove these seals, 90-degree pick, hook inside. There are 2 seals, and they are pulled out from the top side that this unscrewed from. So this is the bushing. Inside here is a brass bushing that can be replaced if it's worn. The first seal is inserted the spring side facing the engine. So this is the seal before it is packed with grease. You can see there's a spring that goes around the inside, and that will face the engine. This set screw is closer towards the engine than this open end, so the spring will face downward when going into this housing. This is the bearing when it is fully packed with grease. This is the non-spring side. Spring side is over here. You can no longer see the spring, and that space is completely filled with grease. So that will face down and slide into the housing. I did clean out the housing of the old grease and anything that was still in the threads with a paper towel and some brake cleaner. And the second washer goes in with the spring side facing the propeller. So that would be facing towards you as you are placing it in here. So again, this is the back side, no spring, spring side, and then it gets set down inside of here. We've already got the first one in, spring facing towards the engine. Second one, spring faces the propeller. Now that both are seated inside of the housing, I pack grease in between both of the replaced seals. You should be able to feel a gap when you put your finger in. Just pack that full of grease. Now that both new seals are in and it's been packed with grease, the last thing you need to do is put blue Loctite around the threads here, and then this just is reinstalled and screwed on to the housing. I would recommend cleaning the excess grease that will be on the threads so that the blue Loctite can actually do its job. And that is pretty much everything you need to do to replace these seals. And then everything is put back together the same way it was removed. And that completes replacing the lower seals and bushing if you needed to. That obviously is just removed and replaced. So today we'll be replacing the upper seals. As you can see, with the amount of grease coming out the top, this obviously needs to be replaced. First thing we need to do is cut this lacing wire off of this lock nut on the U-joint and remove that bolt. Now that the lacing wire has been removed, this unscrews. It was pretty stuck in there. Takes a 3/8 open end wrench. Spin that out of there, and then this bolt comes out, which is what clamps the U-joint to the shaft. Now you need an Allen wrench to remove this set screw to pull this collar off. So once the set screw is loosened, I used a piece of wood and set it on the back here so you don't damage the threads, and hit it with a hammer a few times to drive the shaft forward so that there was a gap between this and the housing. I could get a screwdriver in and just slowly wedge it off of the housing. There's a lip right here that this fits into, and then it is tight around the shaft. So removing the shaft from the U-joint, I put a big screwdriver in the U-joint. There's a gap here, just to open that up a little bit more, make it easier to pull out. I did have to get a pry bar to start this initially to get slid out, and after that it came out fairly easily. No crazy prying or anything like that. If you pry too hard, you can damage this U-joint. When removing the shaft, there's a cut in the actual shaft, and there's a small block that fits into that gap, and also there's a cut in the U-joint, and that needs to line up. Don't lose this piece, because that's what locks the shaft to the unit. So after the collar is completely removed, the shaft just gets pulled right out the end, and should be able to see straight through. So to remove this housing, I used a big pipe wrench. It's just regular threads, left loose this time. And inside is a bearing set that sits inside of here like so, essentially. This is facing back towards the propeller on this side, and the bearing sits inside of this. Seal sits right where my finger is. It came out. I used a 7/8 socket to go in from this side, and I was able to just hold on to this housing and tap it with a hammer, and the bearing and the seal just popped right out. So nothing crazy. You should be able to reuse the bearing if the bearing is still good. If not, you just swap out your old bearing with a new one. So I cleaned everything up. This is the housing, bearing. Still going to use the old bearing. It's still good. You can feel there's no grinding or anything gritty that would indicate bad bearings. So we're going to reuse that. And this is the old seal we're replacing with this. This goes into this housing with the spring facing the large opening, so where the actual bearing fits. So it just drops in with the spring facing you, and that has to get tapped in or pressed in. Now that the seal has been pressed in, just add a little bit of grease to the back side just to help out this bearing before you replace the bearing back inside. The lip faces out. Just tap that back into the housing. You'll also want to pack this seal with grease, just like the ones for the lower seals. And before you replace this upper housing, I put the shaft back in just to ensure that I don't mess up the seals if I were to push the shaft back in after this were installed. This way I have more control over it and can maneuver it better to protect the seal. Before you put the shaft back into the U-joint, be sure the collar has been put onto the shaft but not tightened until everything on the U-joint has been tightened down. Then the collar gets installed and tightened down. So I used a 2x4 to tap the shaft from the back into the U-joint. That small square block of steel should be flush with this outside edge and on the inside. Make sure it goes back to right where it was, because there was an indentation for where this lock screw goes in. You want to make sure that it's on the same spot so you don't damage the shaft. And then everything gets put back together the same way it came apart. We'll tighten this down, we'll tighten this down, and then run lacing wire through this bolt to make sure that it doesn't come loose, so it looks similar to the one that hooks to the engine. I also replaced the grease zerk that had been broken off, and that should finish up the upper seal replacement. This should be screwed on to the shaft, even though there aren't threads here. It's on the seals, and you don't want to mess up the brand new seals that you just put on by pushing them over top of these threads. So just take the time, twist this on, and pretty soon you'll make it to the smooth part and slide the rest of the way on. Like so. And then this gets screwed on to its own housing, and then you tighten that down with a pipe wrench, and then tighten the set screw, and that is it for the seals. To reinstall the propeller, it is the exact same, just reverse of taking everything off. Ensure that the lower seal housing is tightened on using a pipe wrench, and the Allen key has been tightened down. Then when I put on the first nut that goes on the back of the propeller, I screw it all the way down until it reaches the end of the threads, and then back it off half to a full turn, just so we're not putting any pressure on the threads of the nut. As we tighten everything down, we want that to be able to be free and not mess up the threads and have it be a big struggle to get off when we do this again. So put the first nut on, and then the propeller goes on, and the numbers face out. So the other side is blank. So you want that side facing back towards the engine. And it just threads back on. As you can see, that rear nut is still able to spin. We don't want to push that too far. Back the propeller up and tighten them onto each other. And then it's the small, thin washer that goes first. And then it's the nut that's not the lock nut. There's no nylon washer inside of it. That's what goes on next. Then the lock washer, split washer, and the nylon lock nut with the nylon facing the outside. And then everything gets tightened down with the 1¼ inch open end wrench. You're going to want to make sure that you tighten the propeller down to this back nut. Doesn't have to be overly tight, but just snug it down so it's not going to want to move when you tighten the rest of these down. This one should get tightened pretty tightly onto the propeller, and then this gets locked down. So with everything installed, new seals replaced, the only thing left to do is to fill everything with grease. The most important one is this one right here. This fills the shaft with grease. It's going to take quite a bit since we pushed everything out when we pushed the shaft back in.